Off the back of the Austrian Grand Prix, the second sprint race of the year and our 5th sprint race ever, I'm still not sold on the concept of the sprint race weekend. So let's get into my thoughts and see whether you agree with me. Firstly, I feel like it takes away from qualifying. The drivers don't seem quite as happy when they get pole. It doesn't mean as much. I think qualifying's a really interesting part of the weekend, and it doesn't feel like it has quite as much impact on a sprint race weekend. The drivers also seem quite muted after the sprint race, and the medal ceremony seems a little bit off. I kind of get that you want to make it a little bit different to the main race Grand Prix, and you don't want to make it quite as ceremonial and quite as big, but the drivers don't seem super happy, and it feels a little bit awkward just kind of standing on these massive like number 1, 2 and 3. Feels a bit odd to me and a bit off, and they've not quite got that right yet. Maybe that's because there's not enough on the line. We have points down from 1st to 8th, and it's only 1 point between each point paying position. Maybe if we slightly tweak that to have a point system of 10, 8, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, there'd be a little bit more on the line for the drivers, and the drivers would be a little bit more willing to go for an overtake, and perhaps would be a little bit happier about winning a sprint race or coming second in a sprint race. Not only this, but I feel like it really disadvantages the perhaps slower teams that have a really great qualifying session, and it gives the top teams more laps to get back into positions you'd expect them to be. If you just take Hamilton and Perez in the Austrian Grand Prix, both of them were out of position in qualifying. Of course, Hamilton had the crash in Q3, and Perez was disqualified in qualifying, so ended up starting 13th. Now, Hamilton only managed to make up 1 place in the sprint race, getting stuck behind the Haas drivers for the majority of the race. But Perez managed to get back up to 5th. Of course, he didn't have such a great race in the end, but it really gave him the opportunity to make up those places where it makes it a lot harder for the teams like Haas that did really well in qualifying to hold on to those positions. Of course, we had Hamilton in Brazil in 2021. He managed to make up 25 places. And while that was an awesome weekend, I don't think he would have won that race if it hadn't have been a sprint race weekend, giving him the opportunity to get back up to 5th. Of course, if you remember, he was disqualified from qualifying and had to start the sprint race at the back, making it up to 5th in the sprint race, and then he dropped back a further 5 places, I think because of an engine penalty, and then went on to win the race. It was awesome, but again, it just drives home my point of it gives drivers the opportunity to make up more places in the sprint race. It just makes it harder for those teams to get those landmark results. Now, of course, Formula One's main motivation is for money, and it feels like a little bit of a money grab and maybe a little bit gimmicky. I don't know if I'm being a little bit old school, but Formula One want to have competitive sessions on the Friday, Saturday and Sunday. I'm guessing with the thought in mind that they'll be able to get more people to the Friday sessions and making more money. On one hand, that makes a lot of sense. We are in a money-driven sport, and without money and sponsorships and ticket sales, we really wouldn't have a sport to watch. It's a highly money-intensive sport. But I don't think we should just be chasing money just for the sake of it. I don't want it to be at the detriment of the sport. I'm not saying the sprint weekend is that disastrous that it's really making a mockery of the sport, but I think we need to be careful on the changes that we make. Also, there seems to be still a lot of confusion about who is rewarded pole. So for the first year, 2021, pole was awarded to the driver that started on pole or won the sprint race. However, for 2022, it's the driver that qualifies first and on pole for the sprint race. For me, that makes a lot of sense. Pole, when you look at the pole stats or the number of poles that drivers have, you always think of who's quick over a 1 lap, and you think of the Ayrton Sennas, the Lewis Hamiltons, those drivers that are absolutely rapid on 1 lap. And it feels like a shame to have an asterisk next to people's pole records saying, well, this was a pole in the sprint race. It doesn't make sense to me. It's a race, it's not a qualifying session. But that is confusing for fans, especially when the commentators are still not sure who gets awarded pole. Some of the sprint races have still been a bit processional. That's possibly because there's not enough on the line for the drivers. As I mentioned earlier, they only get 1 extra point for finishing a place above if they're in the top 8. But it's really crucial for Pirelli and F1 to kind of have a tyre option that's likely to go off with 4 or 5 laps to go, giving teams and drivers a tyre deg offset. That's still really crucial in F1. You know, although we've got cars that can follow more closely, you still need that tyre deg offset to really be able to make an overtake. It's still crucial in the races, and there's a fine balance to getting that right in the sprint races, and I feel like Formula 1 haven't totally got that right yet. In Imola we did have some tyre degradation, and I feel like it worked quite well there. But in Austria, you know, Max was struggling with a little bit of tyre degradation, but it wasn't enough to produce the overtake. So I'm still, you know, maybe F1 haven't quite got it right yet, and I'm not suggesting that we just have tyres for the sprint race, but maybe something to look into. I don't want to make this video all negative though. There are definitely some positives to the sprint race weekends. There's more competitive sessions, which is always a good thing, and definitely introduces more jeopardy into the weekend. There are more opportunities for drivers to have issues or a crash in a race, which of course we don't want to see bad crashes, but there are opportunities for drivers to go further back for the main race, which does create some interesting opportunities. And with only one practice session before qualifying and then one practice session before the race, it gives teams less opportunities to get their setups nailed in. So again, creates more opportunity for a driver to get something wrong and needing to make more overtakes and pass more cars. It does make it quite hard for teams with less experience or even rookie drivers though. I do feel for them. You know, only having 1 hour to practice before a qualifying session, if you're new to a track, is pretty difficult. And if teams don't have historic data for those racetracks, it's going to make it so hard for those teams. I'd be really interested to hear what you think about the sprint race weekends. Am I being a bit old school and do I need to get with the times? If you enjoyed the video, please consider dropping a like and subscribe for more F1 content. If you haven't already, check out my video on my top 10 F1 YouTube channels. You never know, you might find your new favourite F1 channel, or you could share a channel that I didn't mention that's one of your favourites. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.